Hey, how's it going? My name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be doing my August wrap-up. It's already the end of August, can you believe it? You could almost say August slipped away into a moment in time. Or August sipped away like a bottle of wine. You know I had to do it, you know I had to. But wow, August is already gone, summer is basically over, fall is basically here, and I am so alive right now. I'm so excited. So in the month of August, I read a total of 14 books, which is actually pretty surprising to me because at the beginning of August, I told myself this is gonna be my month to like take it easy and take it slow and like not really worry about like reading and my numbers and everything, but like still managed to read 14 books somehow. And I actually managed to complete my Goodreads goal this month of 100 books, and I think I'm at 101 books for the year now, which is crazy because this is the earliest in the year that I've ever reached my goal of 100 books. So who knows how many books I'm going to be able to read this year. I'm very excited about it. I had 4 5-star books this month, 8 4-star books, 1 3.5-star book, and then 1 2.5-star book. It was mostly a really good month. I mostly read things that I loved, and I was only slightly disappointed by like 2 books. So that's pretty awesome. Then as far as the genres go that I was reading this month, I had 5 horror novels, 3 thrillers, 3 young adult romances, 1 sci-fi, 1 nonfiction, and 1 literary fiction. And you can obviously assume that I read so many horrors this month because this was the month that me and Olivia hosted Summerween for the very first time, and it was very successful and very fun. Alright, so let's just jump into what I actually read this month. So the very first book that I picked up this month is this horror novel called The Patient by Jasper DeWitt. This book took me completely by surprise, became one of my new favorite horror books ever. This book was recommended to me because a lot of people compared it to The Silent Patient and said that it was very similar to that, and I would have to agree, but also I think this book is doing something completely different from The Silent Patient. But this book, it's a horror book, and it takes place in like this mental institute where we're kind of learning about this guy who has been in the mental hospital since he was a kid, and there's some freaky unexplainable shit happening with him that is truly terrifying. And this is a book that I was reading the ebook on my phone, and I was reading it mostly like in the dark at night. I literally had to stop reading this book because I was getting so freaked out. Like, this is one of the only books ever that I literally could not continue reading it because I was getting so scared, and like I lost sleep over this book. Like, this book was giving me nightmares, and the ending was really great, and I love books like this. Like, this is like my favorite type of horror novel. It's just so effective, and just some of the scenes, I think like why this book scared me so much is I'm really freaked out by like kids doing weird shit that's like unexplainable. That just like really got to me in this book. But like, wow, if you need a really genuinely scary horror recommendation, this is that book. Second book that I read this month is The Voting Booth by Brandy Colbert, and I actually listened to the audiobook for this one on Libro. And this one follows this young girl who cares very much about voting and about everyone in her community having the right to vote. And so she meets this guy that's her age on voting day, but he gets turned away at the polling place, so she makes it like her mission for that day to like help him find somewhere where he can vote, and so that his vote is counted and his voice is heard. And I think the best thing about this book is the relevance right now. Like, I think this book is so important for young people to be reading because it's emphasizing the importance of young people using their voice and like showing them that their voice matters and their vote matters. And when you are eligible to vote, you need to be using that privilege to vote, because if you want to see change, you gotta vote. And so I really loved this book just for that message alone, and I thought that this book was just really well developed, and I cared about these characters, I cared about their families, I thought all the characters were very fleshed out, and it also has some like cute romance bits in here too. So I just really enjoyed this book. I could get 4 out of 5 stars. The third book I read this month is The Night Swim by Megan Golden, and this was the first book that I read for this video that I did earlier this month where I read 3 new thrillers, and this was also one of the book of the month selections for the month of August. And this thriller was very intense and very dark. So this thriller basically follows this girl, Rachel, who runs this true crime podcast, and it's a very successful podcast, and for the 3rd season of it, she's going to this small town where she wants to cover this active, ongoing rape case where the town's golden boy has raped this girl. And simultaneously, while that is happening, we get alternate chapters with this other girl who is writing letters to Rachel asking her to like talk about her sister's case, because her sister mysteriously died like years and years and years ago, and they never got full closure over like what happened to her sister, and everybody just thinks she's like the town slut and like nobody really cares, but her sister like wants answers about what happened to her sister all those years ago. So the rape in this book is a very heavy trigger. It is not something that's easy to read about, and especially as it progresses towards the end of this book, like it got to be a little much for me, honestly. Like, and usually I can handle most trigger warnings and things like that in books, but this one was especially difficult for some reason. So this book is definitely pretty dark and heavy, so just know that going in. But this book is also incredible. Like, it is so freaking good. And the court scenes were actually super, super interesting. Like, I'm not usually one that loves to read about like courtroom battles, but like this one was so freaking good. And the way that this book touches on like our rape culture and how we handle rape victims, and God, it was literally like moving me to tears almost. Like, it was so good. The only reason why this one got a 4 out of 5 as opposed to a 5 out of 5 is because I thought the chapters with the sister, kind of just talking about her sister, kind of slowed the book down for me, because I was just really eager to get back to the court scene chapters. So I was just like trying to skim those chapters to get back to the story that I was most interested in. But I also did like the story of the sisters and like her talking about her sister who had died, but it just felt less of like a thriller in those moments and more of just like a contemporary story about these sisters. So I was just really like interested in getting back to the court scenes. But this book is really great. It's so good, and I would highly, highly recommend it. The next one I read is The End of Her by Sherry Lupina. This is the 2nd book that I read for that video, and this is my most disappointing book of the entire month. Like, this is my least favorite thing that I read this month. I went into this one not really knowing a whole lot of what it was about, but I just love Sherry Lupina, so I just trusted it and just went with it. This book was just so boring, kind of, like, and I didn't realize that this book is kind of just about this guy getting blackmailed by somebody from his past, and then the entire book is just like them talking about the blackmail and thinking about the blackmail and like, what are we gonna do about this blackmail? And it was just kind of boring, honestly. And like, the ending definitely was more satisfying. Like, I was satisfied with how the story ended, but the entirety of the book was just really boring and just didn't do it for me. So this is the one that got 2.5 out of 5 stars. And then the next book that I read this month was Playing Nice by J.P. Delaney, and this book surprised the hell out of me because this book had one of the most interesting premises of a thriller that I've read in a long time, but I just didn't imagine that it would actually live up to that. And this book, ever since I've read it, I've been talking about this book with like everyone I know in real life and asking them like, what would you do in this situation, because it's totally bonkers. And so in this thriller we follow this couple who has this 2-year-old son, and then one day this couple comes to their house and they're like, hey, so our kids got mixed up at birth, and we have your son and you have our son, and we have DNA evidence right here. And when they see this kid, that's the other couple's kid, they just know like that's their kid because they can tell like by how they look. And so then we begin this journey with them of trying to figure out like what to do, because it's like you've already formed this bond and this attachment to this child that you have, and now you're finding out that your biological child is out there getting raised by these strangers. Like, how do you go about this situation? It's freaking crazy. And this book was the most wild ride. It had so many plot twists. It was just such a well-written book. The ending was so good. The ending was so satisfying, and it was just like a perfect thriller for me. So this was a 5-star book for me. I highly recommend this one. It was so much fun. Next book I read this month was The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, and this book was one of my most anticipated, especially after reading The Mothers recently, and this book was so freaking beautiful. It follows these two sisters, Stella and Desiree, and they had grown up in this really small town where nearly every black resident was so light-skinned that they were nearly white passing. And then this book follows them years and years later when they're adults, and they're both living very different lives. One of the girls is married to a white man and living a very white passing life. And then the other sister, Desiree, is married to a black man, and she finds herself back in the small town where she grew up in. This book touches on issues like the lightness of your skin and like the unconscious biases that exist within the black community, like considering some people to be not black enough and different things like that. But not only does this book touch on like race and on identity, but it's also just a really strong family story in this book, and the family dynamics are what really touched me about this book. I love stories that follow sisters, obviously, so that was definitely one of my favorite aspects about this book. And I don't know, I love books that are simultaneously very educational like this, but also are so powerful and just genuinely a really good story. And I ended up giving this book 4 out of 5 stars. The only reason it wasn't a 5 out of 5 from me is because I did feel like some parts of this book were so slow and kind of like hard to get through, and that's actually why I ended up downloading the audiobook for this one from my library, and then I was using the audiobook to help get me through the slower parts. But overall, I do think this is a very stunning, beautiful story. And then the next book that I read this month was Stay Gold by Tobley McSmith, and this is a young adult kind of contemporary romance kind of story. So in this book, we follow this trans character named Pony. He moves to this new small town and he starts to form this relationship with this cheerleader. This book is just the cutest thing ever. I listened to the audiobook for this and it just genuinely made my heart so happy for like most of this story. I will warn you though that there are some trigger warnings in this book for things like dysphoria, transphobia, homophobia, bullying, use of slurs, alcoholism, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, public outings, and death of a loved one. So this is definitely not your like typical soft, cute young adult contemporary. Like, this book is heavy and this book is intense at times, but this audiobook literally had me crying while I was driving numerous times because I just got so attached to these characters. Like, I don't know what it was about this book, but I just adored it so hard. I do know though that some trans people had a problem with this book because the character is kind of like forced into a situation where they feel like they have to let everyone know that they're trans in order to like feel like they're a part of the trans community. Like, they get pressure from their trans friends in this book to come out because they don't feel like Pony is like representing their community enough or things like that. And so I know that some people have a problem with that because it's not always safe for trans people to come out, and like they should never feel any pressure to if they're not ready, and like it's their business, so like they should never feel any pressure about that anyways. But despite that aspect of the book, I really loved it, and it just made me so emotional, and I just really adored all of these characters. And like, this is one that I could see myself rereading it in the future. Like, that's how much I genuinely loved it. So I ended up giving this one 5 out of 5 stars. It was really good. Then the next book I listened to was also an audiobook, and it was The Beauty in Breaking by Michelle Harper. And this one is the only nonfiction book that I read this month. And this one is about this woman who is an ER doctor, and she's writing this book about the difficulties of being a black woman in a field that's mostly dominated by white men. And this book was interesting for a number of reasons, because I've never read a nonfiction book that is written by a medical professional or a doctor. So like, I found that to be really interesting because she has many different emergency room stories that was just fascinating to hear about. And I do think that this book also talks about some things that aren't really talked about or well known in the world, like how black people aren't always treated fairly when it comes to receiving medical care, or how police will kind of take advantage of situations that they don't have any right to do. Like, when they bring in some people that are criminals, they'll just ask the doctors to like test them for drugs and stuff without any proper like legal way of doing it. They just expect the doctors to do it, and the doctors don't know that they can decline it or say no. And like it's a very interesting conversation happening in this book, and I think it's a really important one. And yeah, I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. I thought it was really good and really interesting. And then the next book that I read this month was The Institute by Stephen King, which I'm so stoked that I finally read this book, because this one has been on my TBR for freaking so long. And I did do an entire reading vlog dedicated to this book, so that will be linked down below if you missed it. But this book was really fun. I would consider this one to be more of like a sci-fi than a horror book, and it definitely has those like Stranger Things vibes, you know, because it's following all these like young kids that have these like weird kind of like supernatural abilities, kind of like 11. In this book, we're following this young boy named Luke, who gets captured one night by these people who are running this place called the Institute. And then it's kind of about how he meets all these other kids at the Institute, and then they're all trying to figure out like what this place is and why they're like capturing all these kids. And this book was just super interesting. It was a really cool concept. I really loved all of the characters. Like the characters in this book are really well written. I love this one character, Tim, which is like the first character that we're introduced to in this book. He reminded me so much of like Hopper in Stranger Things. Like he was just so cool. I don't know, I really loved this book. I also listened to the audiobook while I was reading this, and it was just such a fun experience. Like I just flew through this book within like 2 days, and I loved it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It was really good, and it ranks pretty high on the Stephen King scale for me. Alright, and then the next book that I read this month was Heartbones by Colleen Hoover. This one is a young adult slash new adult. I don't really know what it's considered, but it's like a romance. It follows this girl who's like 18-ish years old, so I don't know if it's considered young adult, but it felt pretty young adult to me. This book is very dark. I mean, as you know with most Colleen Hoover books, like they're not just your typical like light-hearted books. Like they're usually pretty dark under the surface. And so this one follows this girl, Bea, who lives in a trailer park with her mom, who's an addict. And right at the beginning of this book, her mom overdoses and dies. And so she's kind of left in a situation where she's homeless. She doesn't know what to do. And so she calls up her dad, who she hasn't talked to in like years and years and years, and asks if she can stay with him for the summer until she goes to college in the fall. And so she goes to like stay with her dad for the summer, and she doesn't realize that like her dad is married to this new woman who has this daughter that she like starts to get close to, and then she starts to get involved in like the drama of this like beach group of friends. Yeah, I don't know, I really enjoyed this book. Like I was really surprised. Like I wasn't a huge fan of it at the start of it because I just thought it was really sad and heavy and dark, and then I wasn't really like super invested right away in like the friendships she was developing with these people. But like over time, this book just really grew on me, and these characters just really grew on me, and it just like hit me so hard in the feels. Like there were some scenes in this book that were so freaking soft and that I will not forget anytime soon. But this book definitely had its like cheesy moments too, so like it's not a new all-time favorite for me from Colleen Hoover, but it was still really good, and it surprised me by how attached I got to these characters. So I ended up giving this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. I thought it was great. And then the last 4 books that I read this month were all books that I ended up reading for Summerween. So the first one that I read was My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix, and this one was one of the most fun young adult horror things that I've ever read. Not that I've read a whole lot of young adult horror, but you know. But this book was so much fun. It takes place in the 80s, and it follows these 2 girls where one of them, you know, kind of gets possessed. And this book is just kind of about how she's trying to figure out what's going on with her friend, and she's trying to convince everyone in the town that there's something wrong with her friend. And this book was just so entertaining. I love how all the chapter titles are 80s songs, and the vibes in this book are just spectacular. Like it was so much fun. It was a perfect book to read in the summer. It definitely has those summer horror flick vibes, but it was just so much fun. I had the best time, and I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. And this one also had one of the most disturbing scenes that I've ever read in a book since I read The Troop. So yeah, this book gets bonus points for that. It was so good. And the next book I read for that readathon was 1922 by Stephen King, and this one is super short. This is the second Stephen King that I read this month, so yeah, but this book was really short, but it was really dark and really gritty and gruesome, and just like, oh, because this book takes place in 1922, and it follows this guy and his wife, and they both own a part of this land that's like hundreds and hundreds of acres, and she really wants to sell it and he does not want to sell it, but she really wants to sell hers, and if she does sell hers, he'll be forced to sell his. So instead of doing that, he decides to kill her, and he also requests the help of his young son to help kill her, and so they both kill her in this really awful and gruesome way. It's pretty nuts, and this book really made me afraid of rats, which I know is weird to say, but like, holy crap. The imagery in this book is spectacular. It's pretty intense. Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and this is definitely one of Stephen King's best endings, I feel like. Like, the ending of this book was so good. And the next book that I read this month was Clown in a Cornfield by Adam Caesar, and thank you so much to Adam for sending me a signed copy of this. I really, really appreciate it. And so this book is a young adult book that's kind of like a teen slasher movie, honestly. It follows this girl named Quinn who moves to the small town of Kettle Springs. There, she kind of gets involved in this group of teenagers that are very like misfits, you know, like they really don't follow the rules. They do all these pranks that like piss off all the older people in the town. And then there's also clowns involved in this book, and clowns that are very like murderous, and they have chainsaws and axes, and it just gets crazy. It's very violent with its action. There's a lot of gore in this book. It's like your typical slasher movie, you know, and this book was really fun to read. I read most of this book in the dark, which was an experience, and I don't know, I just had a lot of fun with this book. I will admit the only reason why I ended up giving this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars as opposed to something higher is because I think I kind of went in with false expectations. Like, I had just assumed the clown aspect of this book was going to be more like supernatural as opposed to just like a human dressed as a clown, but it was still really fun, and if you go in expecting it to be more of like a slasher story, I think you would have a lot more fun with this, because it was really fun. And then the last book that I read this month was Mallory by Josh Malerman. This one ended up being a 5-star book for me, and I really, really loved it. Like, I think I love this one even more than Bird Box, which is just nuts. And if you didn't know, Mallory is the sequel to Bird Box. It takes place 10 years after the events of Bird Box, and we're following Mallory and the two now teenagers who are 16 years old. And I love that in this book we not only get Mallory's point of view, but we also get the point of view of the two teenagers, which I thought was really interesting. God, this book is just so good. It has this perfect pacing of like action scenes and then thought-provoking chapters of these characters just like really thinking about their lives and like their world. And this book had some really good plot twists towards the end. Like, the plot was picking up so much towards the end, and I was just like, my heart was racing reading this book, and it was just so good. It was unputdownable. I finished this book within 1 day, and I didn't even intend for that to happen. Yeah, I loved it. I loved it so much, and I'm so surprised by how much I loved it. But yeah, August ended up being a pretty great month. I read a lot of really great books, and I had the most fun hosting the Summerween Readathon with Olivia. And yeah, please let me know, how many books were you able to read in the month of August? What was the best book that you read in the month of August? And thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with a new video. Bye. What are we fighting?